If you've ever heard someone describe a fragrance, you've probably come across the idea of base notes, and usually they're described in a very simple way. Top notes come first, middle notes come after, base notes stay the longest. It sounds clear enough. But if you've actually tried to smell a perfume and understand what's going on, base notes are the hardest part to grasp. You don't really notice them at first. They don't stand out. And sometimes it feels like they're not even there. So what exactly are they? The idea of base notes didn't come from marketing. It actually comes from how perfumers started to understand evaporation. Back in the early days of modern perfumery, especially in the 19th century, when chemistry began to influence fragrance creation, perfumers noticed something very consistent. Some materials disappear quickly, others stay for hours, and some stay for days. So instead of thinking of a fragrance as a single smell, they began to think of it as something that unfolds over time. That's where the structure came from. Top notes, what you smell, first heart notes, what defines the character-based notes, what remains when everything else is gone. But base notes were never meant to be the last layer you notice. They were meant to be the foundation that holds everything together. If you think about it, base notes are a bit like gravity in a room. You don't see them, you don't focus on them, but they affect everything else. Without them, the whole composition feels thin, unstable, or unfinished. Most base notes share certain characteristics. They're heavier molecules, which means they evaporate more slowly. They tend to feel warm, deep, soft, sometimes slightly sweet or woody. Common examples include woods like sandalwood or cedar resins like amber, vanilla, musk, patchouli. These are not sharp, attention-grabbing smells. They're the ones that sit close to the skin and slowly expand over time. What makes base notes interesting is that you often don't recognize them directly. Instead, you feel their effect. For example, a fragrance might feel creamy, smooth, grounded, long-lasting. That sensation is usually coming from the base, but your brain doesn't immediately label it as this is sandalwood or this is musk. It just reads it as structure. There's also a historical reason why base notes became so important. In earlier perfumery, many top and middle materials were volatile and didn't last long. Perfumers needed something that could anchor the scent. Natural materials like resins, balsams, and woods were used for this purpose. Things like frankincense, myrrh, labdanum. These materials were used for centuries, not just for fragrance, but also in rituals and preservation. They were valued because they lingered, and that idea carried into modern perfumery. Later in the 20th century, synthetic materials changed everything. One of the most important developments was the creation of synthetic musks. Before that, natural musk was extremely rare and expensive, but synthetic versions allowed perfumers to create that soft, skin-like base more consistently. This changed how fragrances behaved. They became smoother, more diffuse, more abstract, and base notes became less about a single identifiable smell and more about a feeling that surrounds the whole composition. If you look at some well-known fragrances, you can see how base notes define their identity. Take something like Chanel No. 5. Most people think of it as floral, but what gives it its signature character over time is the base. Sandalwood vetiver in a soft, powdery musk. Without that base, the florals would feel sharp and incomplete. Or consider Dior Sauvage. People often describe it as fresh or clean, but what makes it last, or gives it that slightly dry, woody feeling later, is the base of ambroxan woods and musky elements. That base is what creates the trail people notice. Another example is Tom Ford Black Orchid. At first, it can feel dark and rich, but as it develops, the base, with patchouli, vanilla, and balsamic notes, becomes dominant. That's what gives it depth and weight. So base notes are not just something at the end. They're present from the beginning. You just don't recognize them immediately. And this brings us to the most important question. How do you actually learn to smell them? The first step is to stop trying to isolate them too early. If you spray a fragrance and immediately look for base notes, you won't find them. Not because they're not there, but because your brain is still processing the stronger, more volatile parts. Instead, you need to observe change over time. Spray a fragrance and come back to it after. 15 minutes, 1 hour, several hours. Notice what remains when the brightness fades. That remaining structure is where the base lives. Another useful approach is to smell base materials separately. If you have access to sandalwood, vanilla, patchouli, musk-based scents, try smelling them on their own. Pay attention to how they feel rather than what they are. Ask yourself, is this dry or creamy? Does it feel heavy or soft? Does it stay close or expand in the air? These are the qualities your brain will later recognize inside complex fragrances. And finally, comparison is key. Smell two fragrances side by side after they've dried down. Ignore the opening. Focus only on what's left. That's when base notes become easier to notice. Over time, something subtle changes. You stop thinking of fragrance as a sequence of notes and start experiencing it as a structure, with a top, a heart, and a foundation, and base notes are that foundation. Even when you don't notice them, they're shaping everything you smell.